In my second year of college, when I had changed majors for the third time, which drove my parents a little crazy, I planted myself in speech communication, or rhetoric, as it was known back then, and took the required Speech 101, where I learned some basic fundamentals dating back 2,400 years or so to the days of Plato and Aristotle. And these fundamentals were pretty simple. The first was, in order for you to have genuine communication, you needed to have your ideas come from the soul. For the Greek, the soul was the essence of the person, and knowledge of the soul allowed you to communicate in truth. And the second was that you needed to know the other, and you needed to know the other in such a way that you understood how that person ticked. It was able to get through to them. Aristotle said that the art of rhetoric was finding the available means of persuasion in any given case. And in order to do that, you had to know who you were talking to. And then the third thing is a little surprising, but it was a province of rhetoric back then, and that is you had to be willing to change your mind. If you were going to try and convince someone of something, you had to risk similarly changing your own way of thinking. And the reason all this is actually important when we consider this morning's gospel is that the first audience which would have read John's gospel would likely know all this. When you look at this particular gospel from the point of view of the ancient world in which it was written, you can see reflected in many of the passages these classical Greek rhetorical conventions. And so what we might not notice or think important, those original Greek readers would have read that and they would have yelled to their buddies, "Great Zeus! My goodness, hey, Xenocrates, you need to come take a look at this. This is absolutely stunning. It fits into the way we think." They would have seen something in this story that would have, just by the face of it, just by the form of it, struck them as utterly profound. Utterly profound. Let me begin with just a little background. This morning's reading has a certain form to it that would have touched those hearing it as more than just merely interesting. For those who had a basic understanding of the Hebrew scriptures and were of the belief that you needed to be grounded in the foundations of Judaism, which was a popular sentiment at the time, if you were considering Christianity, remember Christianity is a young faith at that particular moment, they would have thought, I know where this is going. I know how it's going to play out. They were familiar with the form. Jeremiah and Isaiah were filled with images of life-giving or living waters. So they would have resonated with this, as events taking place around wells had always been spiritually loaded. But let's suppose you were on the other side. You were Greek thinking through and through, as would also be a good percentage of John's audience, maybe the vast majority of it. You similarly had stories with water as a theme, and you also knew that something divine had to be going on here. Noads were female spirits that were found in and around flowing fresh water. For the Greeks, underneath the surface of the earth, all the waters connected one another, and so water that would come out of a well was the same as water that was flowing down a stream. So what is really interesting about this story is that the gift of living water, which Jesus proclaimed that he could give, would have brought up all these cultural and religious memories to both Jews and Greeks. And so this account, but one of many moments in Jesus' life, was an absolutely brilliant addition to the gospel as it bridged ethnic boundaries that we just might not appreciate. Back then, this form of what John was doing shaped the telling of good news, not just people who were familiar with Jesus, but with all the people that would be reading it. Let me give you another example of what I mean by this. If those hearing this particular gospel were steeped in Jewish thought, they were familiar with stories involving a man and a woman and a well. And a case in point is Isaac and Rebekah. Jacob and Rachel in the book of Genesis, and Moses and Zipporah in Exodus. All of them began their lives together in a time and place in which a well played a prominent role. A man and woman would meet at a well, fall in love, and then they'd get married. It was a form of a romantic story leading to a very predictable end. And in Greek thought, this was also a familiar form of a story as well, because there was not only mythology involving living water, waters that flowed, even those that came out of a well, but also the memory of a widely practiced ceremony marking the coming to age of young people that would take place at a well. Believe it or not, they would clip off a lock of their hair and drop it down the well, and that somehow started their movement into adulthood. In my case, you would have had to search for that, because I've looked like this since I've been in 3rd grade, you know. However, in this particular case, Jesus and the woman were hardly candidates for marriage, were they? Or a rite saying that they were now adults. So now we have a little twist coming into it. She, after all, had been married 5 times, and at the moment was living with someone not her husband. Now, it is important that we not read a whole lot into that. Her 5 marriages can be explained by something called levirate marriage. If she was a widow, in this law that was found in the book of Deuteronomy, she was required to marry her late husband's brother. And then when he died, she was required to marry the next brother, and so on. All of this would ensure that her son, that's who we were concerned about back then, would have a father whose presence would keep the name and the family line chugging along. So that might have been the whole explanation between the multiplicity of marriages. As well, there was nothing back then that actually required her to be married to the person with whom she was living. So that in itself was not necessarily a big deal. What was important about that is that Jesus was demonstrating one of those rhetorical conventions. I know this person backwards and forwards. People would have seen that. These circumstances showed to those original audiences, Greek and Jewish alike, that this story had started out common enough. Remember, we know how it's going to end. But now it was turning into something that was reflecting the way that things did not necessarily work. In particular, for the Greeks, this story was proclaiming that Jesus now had great credibility, in that he knew who he was, and he knew who she was. And in that, he could now speak truthfully. And they would have seen that. They would have bought into it big time. Well, now comes, at least in my mind, I get pretty excited about this stuff, the most interesting development in the whole story, at least, again, how I see it. Both of them had confessed their background. Hers as a Samaritan worshiping on Mount Gerizim, and his as a Jew worshiping in Jerusalem. So you kind of have to wonder at that point, who's going to blink first? Who's going to give in to the other? Because something had happened in this story that had the need now for someone to change. And remember, change is a good thing. Change does not mean that you lost the argument. Change means that you had now come to the center of truth, to a real awareness of the soul. And what happens? It turns out both of them changed. Both of them did. Both turned away from a strict observance of the geographical centers of their faiths. When Jesus proclaimed in the midst of their encounter, "The hour is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, where I am supposed to culturally hang out. The hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in truth and spirit." And the woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he's going to proclaim all to us." And this is the point to those reading would have said, this is absolutely stunning, because what's Jesus say? I am he, the one who is speaking to you. They would have looked at that and they would have said, this man tells the truth. We've got to believe it. Because he was singing a new song different from where he began. He was the real deal. And to him, they would listen. All the people in the village would listen, just as the woman did. His credibility was cemented with the woman, her fellow Samaritans, and those reading this story, because he left something of himself, actually the totality of self, with those that he had encountered, having been fully touched by everyone he met, would have said, wow, look at that. While we have no doubt that the woman's life changed forever, after all, she announced that, this was also a moment in which Jesus' life changed. Admittedly, now we have spent some time in the deep woods this morning, but hopefully the point seems worthwhile. When it comes to sharing the faith with another, we are not just in the business of telling someone something and hoping they get it by our just winning the argument with them. We instead have been commissioned to be similarly touched in the process, moved by the other. And if this seems just a very, very subtle thing, hardly worth bringing up this morning, I ask you, when you go home, look again at the morning newspaper and read anything in it political from the national perspective. You will see that often we no longer really know and, in many cases, value to whom we are speaking, if we are from a very different place or we hold very dissimilar ideas. We're out to win. It's something cultural with all of us, every party, every stripe. The marked change in Jesus and the woman, by their willingness to be moved by the other, feels not the way that the world works anymore when it comes to the marketplace of ideas, and that's very sad. But swimming upstream, seemingly, it is to this very movement in life that we are called to make a difference by risking being faithfully receptive to the other. Not necessarily always agreeing, but at least being receptive to the other, and that attempt to become one. Easier said than done? Well, sure it is, but it is worth the effort. After all, it enabled a foreigner, Jesus, to not just turn some heads, but also to turn some hearts, some minds as well. Remember, he could have said, and he was expected to say, when he looked at the Samaritan woman, "You fool, I don't talk to people like you." But he did. He did what he wasn't supposed to do. He crossed cultures, and then he conversed with the other. That was the risk that he took. That's the risk that all of us are asked to take. And as a consequence, back then, joy fell upon grace, and it rained. How glorious it is for us to practice that kind of reconciliation today. Amen.